you feeling overwhelmed, stuck, or uncertain about how to grow your business without sacrificing what really matters most? Welcome to The Business You Really Want, the show for women ready to build a sustainable, fully aligned business. Aligned with what, you ask? You, your values, your life. Seriously, it is possible. I'm Tonya Kubo, and along with business advisor extraordinaire Gwen Bortner, we're here to show you how. Welcome back to The Business You Really Want. Today, we are closing out our From Solo to CEO series with a topic that I think, actually, Gwen, is overlooked way too often, which is how to balance the demands of leadership with your own personal growth and self-care, right? Leading a growing business is so exciting, but it comes with stress and challenges that take a toll on everybody's well-being. And so in this episode, we are going to talk you through how you can thrive as both a CEO and an actual living, breathing human by prioritizing your personal growth and well-being. Just in case you're new to the show, my name is Tonya Kubo. I'm here with my absolute favorite operations expert, Gwen Bortner. And I just think that we need to talk about this more, especially in public settings. Gwen, these conversations happen behind closed doors all the time, but I very rarely hear anybody publicly talk about why it is so important to focus on your own individual growth as a CEO while balancing the dual responsibilities of leading your team and leading yourself. So I'm just curious, Gwen, if you have maybe a quick story, because I mean, your career spans over 40 years. Or maybe just 40 years. I don't want to age you more than the calendar already has. I'll say it like that. But I'm curious from your own experience if you can maybe come up with a quick example of how personal growth has impacted your own leadership journey.
So it's interesting because I've always seen all three of these integrated. And it may have been one of the reasons that I had quite a bit of early success in my life career thing. And
life career thing. I like that.
I mean, it's all those things, right? And part of it is, you said I've been doing this for a little over 40 years now. And part of that is I started young. And so part of this was being able to establish some habits and behaviors early in my process. So one of the things that I think it's important to acknowledge is depending on what your personal, path has been, and there's so many choices along this path. I mean, there's practically an infinite number of choices along the path. This may feel more intuitive for you because you've been doing it for a really long time. This may feel completely counterintuitive because it goes against everything, all of the trainings, all of the behaviors, all of the actions that you've been taking. But for me, what I saw was when I grow as a person, I can't help but grow as a leader. Now, I know that's not absolutely true, but there is also a lot of natural leader instincts, behaviors at a very young age, right? I'm not even talking about adulthood. I'm talking about junior high, right? So those things always tied together for me. So that's part of the reason. And I also have always had a pretty strong understanding that if I'm not at my best, there's no way I can be at my best for anyone else, which is back to the self-care piece. And either the way I often thought about it is I am selfish and I'm okay with it. And where a lot of women have been taught, no, you can't be selfish. And they see self-care as selfish instead of self-care. And so for me, this has been like a super obvious, easy journey. And I know that I am the unicorn. And I get that. And I acknowledge it when I'm working with my clients. I don't expect them to have anything close to my same experience.
Okay. Well, I think that makes everybody feel better, that we are not expected to be like you, Gwen, because you are a superlative
really wants
human.
To be like me, really. I mean, they may think they do, but really, trust me, they don't really want to be like me.
Well, and what I see is that, I see this expectation that entrepreneurs are always supposed to be on in order to run their businesses successfully. And, I have children, right? And so I remember seeing a meme a few years ago and thinking like, oh, that's exactly it, right? Like I'm expected to show up to work as if I don't have children. And then I'm supposed to parent my children as if I don't have work. Right. So there's this expectation that in order to be successful, we have to be on, we have to be like go time all the time. Then there's this other side of it, right? Like we have all seen what happens when somebody, especially a business owner, does not take care of themselves. And so I'm curious from your perspective, Gwen, what have you seen happen in the cases of CEOs who neglect themselves?
And it's not even necessarily that they neglect themselves. So I'm going to be conscious about that because when you say that, often they don't think that they're neglecting themselves. And so that's why I don't want to use that phrase. They don't see it that way, because I hear phrases like, but I love what I do, so I'm going to do it all the time. So they don't see it as neglecting themselves. I love my customers. I love what I do. I don't know, kind of trite line of, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. Well, that's not actually true, people. You can love what you do, but it's still work.
Right.
So I think pulling that piece away and saying that's not necessarily like, I know I'm neglecting myself, because I think a lot of people don't, which is where the problem actually lies, because they're often conflating multiple things and not seeing how they're different and how they provide different aspects to their lives. It's also why I rail against the word balance, because often we think of balance like a teeter-totter and it has to be absolutely equal. And that's not really it. It's about sometimes this is taking more of my life and sometimes that is taking more of my life. And it goes back and forth. And the trick is that all of the work, all of my personal life, and all of my self-care can't take all of my life all at the same time, because that would be 300% and we don't have 300%. It's also why I hate the thing of like, I give 110%. You can't give 110%. You only have 100% to give. Your 100% may look like 110% compared to other people because you're more outstanding, but it's still your 100%. And so understanding where those percentages are falling at any point in time, because you can't give 100% to all three, because there is no such thing as you giving 300%.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think that is important also, is understanding that, not everybody martyrs themselves. And I also think it's important to draw a distinction between personal growth and self-care, right? Because they're not necessarily the same. I mean, sometimes personal growth is investing in therapy, which some people would consider self-care. Sometimes personal growth is investing in your own professional development, in altering your mindset. How do you see, because I know you're a believer in continuous personal development. How do you see investing in your own development as a CEO, as a leader? How do you see that help CEOs make better decisions and maybe affect how they lead, not just say how they manage stress?
For me, personal development is the idea that because I have new knowledge, I am going to approach a similar or a same situation differently, with the expectation of getting a different and hopefully better result. And I say hopefully better because just because someone said it should be better doesn't mean that it will be better for you. But it's that concept of, I'm going to look at this thing that I looked at, maybe a week ago, but maybe a year ago, or maybe 10 years ago, with a different set of eyes because I have gained new knowledge and I have figured out how to apply it to this situation. And our work together is a great example of that, right? We've been working through some development issues, and part of it is my willingness to get some personal development. And sometimes this personal development is just the conversation between you and I. It's not a formal program. It's not, but being willing to hear it as, have you thought about considering it this way? Right? To me, that's also personal development. It doesn't have to be a formal program.
Yeah, it's like what I have found in my own business is, when I decided to hang out my shingle and become a consultant, I knew the jobs that I had. I knew the style of leadership I had worked under, the style of leadership I had observed, but that was the sum total of my perspective. That was my worldview. Somebody would recommend a business book. I'd pick up that business book, read that, maybe I'd get some ideas, but I wasn't the type of person that walked up and down the aisles of a bookstore looking for a book to make me better at what I did. And what I find about, personal growth, whether that's hiring a coach or, like you said, just having some biz bestie conversations, right, on a peer-to-peer level, is it's given me a different way to look at things. It's shown me that just because my experience, like the last time I saw this was because of this other thing, doesn't mean that's the only reason that thing happens. And like you said, it's given me more options of how to move forward. So I love that you painted that picture for us, because I do see the personal growth piece for CEOs directly tied to business performance. But I know a lot of CEOs don't. They don't. They figure like the company's still making money, I must be doing fine. And so they don't invest in themselves to become stronger, more resilient leaders. And I think sometimes it's the detriment to their company.
Well, and that the whole thing is, yeah, you're doing great. But I think typically entrepreneurs also are always looking to, can I do better?
Mm.
And so doing really well, and kind of going back to my earlier example, a lot of folks would say, oh, you're doing 110%. That's because you naturally do better than a lot of people. But that doesn't mean that's still the top of your capabilities. And wouldn't you love to do better beyond that where you currently are, right? And I think having that approach to say, is it possible to think about this differently, to do it differently, to ask different questions, to behave differently, to, all of those things. Not that you should just constantly be learning, because that can also be a trap as well. But looking for, where is that nugget? Where is that thing that says, that makes me think maybe I could try something different that might get me a different result that's closer to the result that I'm really looking for, or a better result that I'm already getting.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. You said it very, very well. So we talked a little bit. That might be a first. That might be a first, actually. We've talked a little bit about the self-care piece. In part 3 of this series, I spoke about the connection between delegation and avoiding burnout, or resistant to delegation leading to burnout. I do think this is an episode where we do need to touch a little bit more deeply on burnout, because, we were at an event recently and they talked about, well, you explained the $1 million horse analogy.
So one of the analogies they use at Genius Network, which is one of the events that I attend on a regular basis, is the $1 million horse analogy. And that is, if you had $1 million racehorse, would you run it as many miles as you could every day, make sure it didn't get nearly enough sleep, and possibly feed it, the horse version of junk food? No, because you want that horse to be running optimally when the race is actually worth $1 million. And if they've done that several times and now even, they're out for stud, as it were, they're not running anymore, we still want to make sure that we're keeping them alive, that we're keeping them healthy, that we're doing all the things that have to be done to get that value. And what we forget is, as the entrepreneur, as the founder, as the CEO, as the visionary for the business, whatever terms you think of yourself in terms of, we are the $1 million racehorse for this business. But yet we feel, and although we will make sure our employees are well fed and that they're sleeping well, and, and when I say employees, I'm using it in a very generic term, could be contractors, anyone that's helping support us. We forget to do that for ourselves. And someone else once said, who is the most valuable person in your business? And everyone usually points to somebody else, but you, as the CEO, owner, founder, are the most important person in the business. Because if you go away, unless you do it intentionally by selling it or, something of some other nature, the business goes away. You are the most important person in the business.
Right. And you've said before, your number one job as CEO is to ensure the health and sustainability of your business. And in the case of, a business that has been, a one-person show, right? Solopreneur business that is growing and scaling up, that's still the case. You're still 100% responsible for the health and well-being of your business. And that means being responsible for the health and well-being of yourself. Gwen, when I know what I consider some signs of burnout, like early signs of burnout, that I'm happy to share, but I want to hear yours. Like, what have you seen that have told you, oh.
I want to hear yours first this time. We don't do this very often, but I want to hear yours first.
Go ahead.
No. I want to hear yours first. And then I'll add one or two probably beyond that.
Well, I think for me, what I have learned for myself, the earliest sign of burnout is what I call compassion fatigue. And so compassion fatigue for me is when things that didn't used to get under my skin suddenly do. And I do a lot of peopling, right? That's the nature of marketing, is I work with a lot of people. I answer a lot of questions. I do a lot of tech support, that when it's client facing or even with my own clients. I never get tired of answering questions. I am one of the rare people who does not mind answering the same question 52,000 times. When there's a question that I get very frequently and somebody asks it and I find myself irritated that they asked it and grumbling about answering it, I know I'm on the edge of burnout. I have learned enough by pushing past that feeling that burnout is coming. It's the same way as when, somebody asks me a question and I don't take the time to think about them and how I respond, right? We all have different communication styles. I typically am good about communicating with people in their preferred style versus my own. But when I'm on the edge of burnout or coming close, as the kids these days like to say, I have 0 F's to give.
So that's a perfect example. And I'm going to make it even more generic because I think it's one of the ways. Is when do you start noticing you are not behaving in the way that you would typically behave and the way that you want to behave? Because I think, that can look like a lot of things to a lot of people. I know you well enough, and I am not shaming you about this, but like if you skipped your exercise routine, this would not be a sign of burnout for you. Because, right, I know you well enough to say this.
I am a luxury model. I am not an SUV.
Yeah. That being said, for someone else, that could be a sign of burnout. I'm really good about, running every day or going to the gym or doing whatever my exercise routine is. And when I start skipping it, that's probably a sign of burnout. Like, and that's why you can't give an answer of what does burnout look like. Because if I gave that for you, you'd be like, well, then I must be burned out all the time.
I was born burned out.
Exactly. Right. It's not an appropriate answer for you, but what you just described could easily not be a good answer for somebody else. Right. But I do think that more generic thought of when I'm not doing the things that I typically do very easily, and maybe not easily, but that are just part of what I do. It's part of who I am. It's part of my identity. And, or I'm not doing it in the way that I know is my normal way of doing it. I think both of those things are really where the sign of a burnout is. And from there, the details become immense, as we try to define it. But I think that's the easiest, most generic way to define.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, so now I'd like to just move into some practical tips, right? Like how do we make this all happen, especially when you're running a business that's already busy, right? Like if I imagine that most people listening to this show are not people who are sitting around going, good golly gee, if I only had some work to do, life would be different. I feel like the people listening to this show are people who are listening to this while trying to do 4 other things all at the same time, hoping that some of this like just seeps into their subconsciousness because they don't have much of their conscious brain to give. And I'd love to give that listener some just practical tips for how to prioritize self-care and self-leadership. And I want to sort of out you, because I don't know that we've talked about this on the show yet, but you don't work Fridays. And
generally not. Although, what are we doing today?
Well, hold on. Would you stop stealing my thunder? I had words I was going to say. So you have, ever since I've known you, been really good about not working Fridays. And somebody will say like, oh my gosh, I want to interview you for a podcast, or I want to do this, I want to do that. And here's my availability. And you'd say, actually, I don't work Fridays. Is there another day? And if they say, actually, no, it's a live stream show, I only do Fridays. And you're like, oh, well, in that case, obviously, I can make arrangements to be available on a Friday. But you've also been very careful over the years that if you've had to work on a Friday, like we're working today, you don't work the following Friday because you're like, I know myself too well. If I do it 2 Fridays in a row, suddenly I just added a 5th work day. I want you to talk a little bit about why you don't typically work Fridays and how that helps you create some harmony in your work routine.
There's a couple things that I think are really important to note in this. And it's not for any, I'll say, typical reason that I don't work Fridays. It really is a pragmatic reason for my particular circumstance, which is my husband moves to a 4-10 work schedule Monday through Thursday in the summers. It's only for 2 to 3 months. It's not, a big, long time frame. But the first year that happened, I found I was feeling overwhelmed and couldn't be present in taking an extra day off with my husband. We love to go do stuff, particularly on that Friday when everyone else is still working. And so we want to make the most of that day. But by then, I don't really want to work on Saturday to backfill and so then I'd get to Monday and it was like, I feel way behind. So it was like, how do I adjust my work schedule so that I'm not working Fridays so that when that happens in the summer, it's not a giant panicky thing. So that's the first thing. But what I've also realized and what's been happening, I've been working quite a few Fridays this last quarter or two. And part of the reason is because I've been having to take time off for other personal things during the week. And so yesterday is a perfect example. Yesterday, I actually only worked an hour or 2 that was actually work time because I have some PT. I was getting a manicure. I know this all sounds very luxurious, and it is. But that was the thing is I don't feel like I've worked 5 days this week. I really had only worked 3 days this week. And this is my 4th day. And so sometimes I will swap them out. So I stay conscious of, it's not just I don't work Fridays. I'm really trying to not overwork so that I can do the personal things that I want and need to do. Like I prefer to make doctor's appointments on Fridays, but my dentist also takes Fridays off. So I always have to go see the dentist on Monday through Thursday, but I try to make doctor's appointments on Fridays because that's one of the things that I need to do. And I don't want it interrupting my day, as an example. And so for me, it's a balance of both of these pieces of it and seeing it as a holistic picture as opposed to a hard and fast rule is huge for me. And I think there was a second part to the question, which I haven't answered and I've lost track of.
That's okay. That's okay. Because I'm here for you, Gwen. I'm here. So I know that not everybody has a goal to take Fridays off, and that's fine. But I do think this is a really good example of how you start prioritizing yourself, whatever you need as a CEO. If that's self-care, great. If that's professional development, fine. But taking Fridays off is polarizing. I know a lot of times when I talk to people and it's like, oh yeah, I can totally do that on a Friday because one of the clients that takes a lot of my daytime hours doesn't work Fridays. And, and they'll be like, well, must be nice. Well, I could never do that. Or they'll say, oh, is the business not doing very well? First of all, I know that we are very busy 4 days a week. I also know, because you've told me, that you feel like you get as much done working a Monday through Friday schedule as you used to do on a Monday through Thursday schedule versus a Monday through Friday schedule. You feel like you haven't actually reduced your productivity. And I happen to think it's because you've developed a routine, right? It's easier to make decisions because Friday's just not an option. And like you said, with your dentist, because the dentist also doesn't work Friday, and they're not coming in for you on their day off. When you take some time off earlier in the week, then you're like, oh, well, I have Friday now that I can fill it in. So it's not like you're having to pack 40 hours of work into, a 30-hour week because you had to take some time off. So you've established that really strong routine. But here's what else I know. You had to start at one point because you just said you haven't always had this routine. And I think where people get tripped up, it's not that they don't want to do a thing. It's not that they don't want to make room in their schedule for something of personal interest or something to develop themselves, but they don't see how, and they're not sure how they get everybody else on board. So I know there had to be a time when you went from working Fridays to not working Fridays. How did that transition go?
So the first and most important thing was actually the last thing you said, which is where the reason people struggle with it is they're worried about how everyone else is going to perceive it. It's often less about the doing of the thing, whatever the thing is, taking Fridays off. It's about the fact that someone's going to say, well, that must be nice. And we're worried about how everyone else is going to perceive it. And I don't worry about those kind of things much because I know I have zero control over what anyone else is going to think. And I also have zero control of how anyone else is going to react. And if it really bothers someone, they're not my people, and that's okay. That is absolutely okay. There are enough people. I am nowhere near capacity, and I am not come close to serving the world. So there are enough people. It is okay. I'm not going to worry about that. But as women, we are often conditioned to worry about what other people think and how they're going to respond. And that's a huge disadvantage we have because that's something we really don't have any control over. Because back to humans, we're dealing with humans and we just can't control any of those things. So part of it is being completely comfortable that there's going to be someone who's going to make some snarky remark, who's going to be upset, who's going to do whatever, and just say like, sorry, that's just the way it is. Now, the other is I also look at it with a pragmatic eye because it's, my reality. The work I'm doing isn't life and death. The fact that I may not answer a call on Friday doesn't mean something horrendous is going to happen. And I'm also enough in touch with my clients. I had one that was dealing with quite a few kind of crisis things. And I said, if you need me on Friday or over the weekend, you text me, I will respond. But I don't say that all the time. And they know that I'm not going to say it. So I have set my boundaries and my expectations in a way that I'm not apologizing for them. Mm-hmm. And I know when I'm going to be flexible about them. I know all of that in my head ahead of time. So back to the decision process, I'm not having any decision fatigue about this. I can very quickly say, does this fit into the Friday? I offered to do this recording on Friday too. I'm not sure you would have asked, but
Nope. I never ask you to do things on Fridays.
Right. I offered because I also know I'm really going to be unavailable because I'm doing quite a bit of travel and other things, and that we needed to do this. Right. So it's not only reducing some stress for me, it's reducing stress for you. And, I don't want you stressed out either, because that's not helpful to me. So, it's being able to say, yeah, no, this is an appropriate trade-off, given what's going on. But one of the things that I will do also on Fridays often is I will take my personal care time on Fridays. Right. And so back to, although it's not work, it's valuable for work.
Yeah. Well, and, I like how you kind of talk about your own process because, for me, it's a little bit different. And I am sort of new at establishing work hours. I have always, just the nature of the work I do, I've always been, accommodated whatever the client schedule was. And my clients had schedules all over the place. But this is a year where, just because of life circumstances, I have found I am not very available after 2:30 in the afternoon. And I tried to do the whole okay, so I'll cut off at 2:30 and then I'll come back at 6 and then I'll, eat dinner and then I'll try to work, 6:30 to 8:30. And, once I was out of my rhythm, I was out of my rhythm. I wasn't doing good work at that time. I'm much better shifting my life earlier and just working, 4 a.m. to 2:30 and calling it good. But it was a tough adjustment for people around me because I had conditioned people that I was always available. And it took some time. And I'm not going to lie, for the listener who's like, I could never do what Gwen does. You can, but I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it's not hard, right? You train people one way. You have to take some time to train them another. But I have not had one person come to me and be like, you know what, Tonya, this just isn't working. You used to always pick up my calls and now you return my voicemails the next day. Or you used to be so good about answering my emails 5 minutes after I sent them. And now I'm finding 6 to 12 hours goes between emails, or 24 to 48, quite honestly. And so what I would encourage any listener who feels like they don't have the boundaries they want and they need to adjust and create some boundaries, to give it some time.
Well, and I think the most important thing you said is it's hard, but it's harder for you than for anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And we always think that we won't do it because it's hard, and we're feeling all of that hardness in our souls and the activity. But most everybody else isn't perceiving it in that same way. It may be hard for them too, but the way that you're feeling about it is way stronger 99% of the time than anyone else is feeling about it. And if there's someone who's really strongly reacting, it's probably because they were really taking bad advantage of you from the get-go. And now you're not holding to that anymore. And now they're really, really grumpy about that. Well, it's probably okay to part ways. You'll be, I mean, there's back to, that's like a whole nother episode we can talk about, but that will be to everyone's advantage in the long run. People who really are your good clients and good fits will say, oh yeah, I've got to change my behavior a little bit. But usually for them, it's really a pretty tiny change. It feels huge to you, but usually for them, that's a little tiny change.
That is so true. And just because somebody complains doesn't mean you owe them going back to the way things used to be. Right? Like, you get to make your own choices. But I like how you acknowledge it is hard for a time. Change is hard. Change is hard for all of us. So as we begin to wrap up, I feel like, okay, we've covered the self-care piece pretty well. We have covered why it's important to prioritize your own growth. If you're going to lead a strong team, you need to be a strong leader of yourself as the CEO. What I would like to do, and mainly this is because I know that you are such a fan of personal growth and leadership development, Gwen, I am, is what would be some advice? Like, where should a listener go from here, right? If they're looking to develop themselves as a leader, obviously we have programs for that, right? We have an amazing accountability program, which I think is a great starting point for anybody who's trying to exercise that muscle of self-leadership in particular, because the best part about being a CEO is nobody tells you what to do. And the worst part about being a CEO is nobody tells you what to do. But in addition to working with our team, I mean, I know you love to read, right? There's books, there's workshops, there's personal development courses. You've mentioned Genius Network, which is a mastermind community you're a part of. What else you got for our listeners, Gwen? What else would you recommend?
Part of it is just being curious all the time and paying attention, because some of the best things I've learned were not in what I would call a learning mode, where I wasn't there to learn, right? For whatever reason. I'm having a conversation with somebody and they say something, and it wasn't like I'm learning something from them. It was just a conversation. All of a sudden it's like, oh, that is the nugget, right? So always listening for the opportunity of, where is there an insight that is actually the insight I need right now, today, this minute, that I maybe didn't even know I needed. And also making sure that you are incorporating some, I'm going to call it more formal ways of learning, like books and conferences and mastermind groups and conversations with other peers. And, where there really is the intention is to come in and learn. But I think it's really about keeping that curiosity option open all the time, which for some of us comes way, way, way more naturally, and for others not, but it still is a skill. It can be learned. It's not a characteristic. It's a skill.
Being curious all the time. That's the big skill. I like that. Any books you want to recommend? You recommended a book in the last episode. Do you want to recommend a book in this episode?
Oh, I want to give like the list of 48 books, because I have lots of favorites at any given point in time, depending on the topic. But just struck me as you said that. It's an older book. It's written by a gal named Annie Duke, Duke. She was a former professional poker player, and it's called Thinking in Bets, Bets. And the big insight, I mean, you need to read the book, even though I'm going to give you the big insight, is a good decision with a bad result doesn't mean it was a bad decision.
Ooh, a good decision with a bad result doesn't mean it was a bad decision. Okay, go on.
And a bad decision with a good result doesn't mean it was a good decision.
Ooh.
And she goes into a whole lot about that. It was a surprise read years and years ago for me that has become one of my favorites. And to me, this is related to all of this about, just because we've tried something and it didn't work doesn't mean it's the right thing to try. And just because we're doing something and it feels like it's working doesn't mean it's really the right thing long term. I mean, if I was going to pick one for this episode, that's going to be
great. And I will put that in the show notes. And I will also say that if business books are your thing, Gwen and I co-lead a fun little book club. It's called the Small Biz Book Club. You can find more information at smallbizbookclub.com. I'll put that in the show notes as well. But every month we grab a book, just like Thinking in Bets, and we take the big ideas in the book and we apply them to the small realities the realities of small businesses. Gosh, I can talk. Really, I can. All right. I think that signals that our time is about up today. So Gwen, thank you for downloading your brain on this important topic, because self-care, self-leadership is just a conversation we need to keep having in public spaces. If you're listening to this episode, I encourage you to be a person having these conversations in public spaces, whether it's with your biz besties, your networking groups, whatever. But the more we talk about this, the more we normalize the importance of prioritizing our own personal growth as CEOs. And if this is something that you want to explore more deeply, I would encourage you to visit us online at thebusinessyoureallywant.com. That is where you're going to find resources and tools that will help you prioritize yourself while you continue growing your business. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for sticking with us through the end of this series, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to The Business You Really Want with Gwen Bortner. I'm Tonya Kubo, reminding you that sustainable success is within reach. Make sure to subscribe to the show and visit thebusinessyoureallywant.com for more resources. Until next time, keep dreaming big and acting with intention.